Afternoon, everybody. We're making your way into our virtual town hall in this special white knuckle edition of the Political Geekfest, as we all sit on the other side of the world fairly powerless and
ineptly watching,
but totally engaged in what's going to happen to democracy as we know it over the next 24 to 48 hours. My name's Peter Lewis. I'm the Director of Essential Media. My partner in crime, Katharine Murphy, Political Editor of Guardian Australia. And we'll be going through this week's Essential Report, which looks at Australians' attitudes to the presidential election, as if that matters, and a few other things besides. I'm assuming that we've got a few people from Melbourne that are watching this before they have their Melbourne Cup celebrations as well. And it's great to see that things have opened up for you guys since we were here last time. Before we get cracking, respects to traditional owners, wherever we are in Australia, we're on land that was never ceded. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation, and I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. You guys all know the rules. Be nice to each other. That's what we've set this thing up for, to support ourselves through times like this. Comments in the chat. We want to have your views as well as just talking at you for the next hour. And hopefully we can share some insights that make us all feel a little bit better. Do we want to talk? I know we're going to talk about Australia's attitudes to the elections as we go through the presentation today, Katharine. But before we kick off, how much of the focus in Canberra is US this week? Like, and how important do you think the outcome is to what goes on over here?
Oh, there's overwhelming focus here, I think, on the outcome of the election. It's obviously, you know, most consequential for Americans, the outcome tomorrow, but also consequential for Australia and the world, if that's not already obvious, just making that point. And yes, people here are literally on tenterhooks, trying to work out what may or may not happen. No one's quite sure whether Trump's going to make a late surge, as he did in the last contest, or whether or not Biden carries the day. It's funny, Peter, isn't it? Because the overwhelming evidence in terms of the data points, polls and so forth, point to a Biden victory. It has tightened a bit, but still Biden is the favourite. But the hesitation is, well, and this is an appropriate thing to say in a polling discussion, can we believe the polls? Can the polls basically, the key question about the polls is whether or not Trump's voting base is adequately tapped in those surveys. You know, are pollsters getting to that kind of rusted on Trump demographic sufficiently for the results to be, you know, accurate? And I guess tomorrow we find out. So there's that. There's concerns, obviously, everyone was watching the reports, whether they're in politics or outside politics, about you know, the potential for the suppression of votes, either through legal proceedings or through other kind of, you know, call it broadly malfeasance. So, you know, hard heads around the place are honestly not sure how this is going to pan out. And there's a certain amount of trepidation that if it's a close result, you know, does America erupt in, you know, some sort of in violent confrontation? Like literally all of those theories are sort of doing the rounds of the water coolers here.
It has, you know, the polling discussion's relevant to today, isn't it? That polling, as we've said on many occasions, it's not a predictor of what happens. It's an indicator of where things are. I think the one thing that I've found interesting is that I think particularly with the way the polls are being portrayed in the States, there's a new level of humility about the polls. They're not being reported as gospel truth, obviously, after what happened last time. And there's probably three things that I think have been interesting. The first is that, as you know, we've shifted the way that we report our vote to include the undecideds. That's also happening with the
Yeah.
polling in the states now, which I
that's
think is really interesting.
Yeah.
The second, and if you're a junkie like me, you'll use 538, which is Nate Silver's aggregation of all the polls.
Yeah.
And rather than giving a scorecard, he's now going on a probability model. So last time when the polls got it wrong, he was predicting, or he doesn't predict, he was saying there was a 1 in 3 chance that Trump would win. This time he's saying there's a 1 in 10. So on one level, that seems like 3 times less likely than what happened last time is occurring. But the other thing I keep thinking is if someone told me I had a 1 in 10 chance of the ceiling falling down tonight, I'd probably check for structural damage.
Or move out of the room. Yeah.
I'll go somewhere else. Now, your colleague Paul Carp responded when I made that point saying that, the problem is there's been structural damage for the last 4 years, and that's probably why there is a 1 in 10 chance of your roof falling in. But there we go. The last point is that he's also, and it's worth digging in, and for those that join us tomorrow, we're just going to be sitting here for 4 hours just sharing each other's pain. You don't have to come to that, Katharine. You'll have to. But they've also been reporting a really interesting metric, which is if the polls were as wrong as last time, where would we be? And even if the polls were as wrong as last time, in those key seats, Biden still appears to be ahead. So that's all heartening. Although the other bit that just freaks me out each time I read it is there's a little rejoinder at the end of it that says this is all premised on the elections being conducted free and fairly. And that is the point. That is actually the unknown. The unknown is actually whether the Postal Service can deal with the run, whether the packed courts cut off voting, and then we're in the territory where the courts could determine the outcome. And for those that are as big a junkie as me, listen to the podcast Fiasco about the Bush-Gore 2000 challenge in Florida. It goes in very deep, and what you end up understanding is just how political the court system in America is, where, we have governments that appoint high court justices, don't we, Katharine? But we don't appoint... I guess there is a sense of a progressive, but we don't have as an expansive a constitution to give them room to play. In Australia, the constitution is pretty boring, and most of the high court judgments, until you get a Lionel Murphy or something in there, they can't really play much around the edges, can they?
Yeah, no, that's right. We do obviously have political appointments in the sense that sort of conservative governments generally favour black letter jurists, and progressive governments like the odd progressive on the bench, but it's certainly not politicised in the same way as it is in the States. And I think all of those high court justices would rather cut off their right arm than appear partisan in any shape or form. And as you say, we're constrained by the lack of the rights culture. I think, though, too, the other thing we should mention, just to add to the list of variables, but the one I think we're both most worried about is this sort of dimension of voter suppression and the democracy of the sort of democratic outcome of a presidential election being in the hands of the courts. So there's that, but sort of a step back from those sort of scenarios, there's the interaction between the popular vote and the electoral college in the United States as well. And there's an interaction between those things, like obviously Hillary Clinton outpolled Donald Trump in the last election, but Trump prevailed in the college. There's various scenarios. You mentioned Nate Silver, Peter. I think his latest blog, which I think is titled provocatively, "I'm here to tell you that Trump can still win," is worth people on the call reviewing if you're really interested, because he does get into, in some depth, the interaction between the popular vote and the electoral college. I think I'm remembering him correctly in saying that if Biden is ahead in the popular vote by more than 2 or 3%, so somewhere between, say, 3 and 5%, the electoral college impact on the contest is nullified. But if Biden is only ahead by a couple of points in the popular vote, there are several pathways that Trump could use in order to prevail through the college. So it's kind of, you don't have to understand these things in excruciating detail, and I certainly don't. But in terms of just watching the results tomorrow, people have to have that fact in the back of their mind, what happens in the college.
Yeah. Just a question from Olivia. So the Nate Silver projection does look at the breakdown. His probability is based on the college vote, not on the popular vote nationally.
Yeah, that's right.
But also on the Senate at the moment, he has the Democrats with a 74 in 100 scenarios of winning the Senate. So again, you know, if we could just bank that and wake up on Thursday, I think we'd all be happy. But you know what? We should dig into some numbers, and we're just going to go into a little bit of a fantasy world first and imagine what if the presidential election was being played out in Australia. I'm just going to see if this works because I've got
with less guns and less courts.
Indeed. Has that shared or not? It hasn't, has it?
It has not, no.
I am going to keep talking for a sec because I have an actual news computer and I didn't set it up for share screen. So I'm going to send this to Zareen and get her to share it. And in a minute, we'll go into the slides. Couple more questions in there though. There was one question here regarding whether the votes on the weekend, the Queensland election, were kind of another poll failure or success. Now, I think there were predictions that Labor would win narrowly. Our model had Labor winning very narrowly, but our sample was very low. And we'll show you a few of the things that have come out the other end in a moment about that. But there's been no talk about the polls getting it particularly wrong or right after Queensland, has there, Katharine?
No, it hasn't really been a feature. I mean, I think the polls probably collectively underestimated Labor's vote, but not to a massive extent. And also, I mean, in all of these conversations, you sort of got to be aware of the voting patterns as well, like whether or not there was a late movement one way or the other. And that's obviously quite difficult for polls to pick up. So no, we haven't had the same conversation post Queensland as we did federally after 2019. And I didn't look at all the polls, Peter. No one was wildly off, were they? I don't think anyone was wildly off.
No. Look, there were projections that it would be tight. There was a lot of chatter within Labor that it was really tight, but
yeah.
It ended up being fairly comfortable.
Yes.
And you know, there is a tradition that the party always says it's going to be tight. Like you can't really lose. You're a genius if then you win, and you also keep the troops engaged and excited about the whole thing.
Oh, I think people were genuinely, like, I don't know, I didn't follow it closely, but I think people were genuinely concerned about how tight it was, and the sort of variable was what was going to happen in North Queensland too, which Labor has perennial nightmares about. But those seats kind of fell Labor's way. So anyway, interesting result, and speaks again to incumbency, which we've talked about in a couple of these conversations. I think if you're an incumbent at the moment and you do a good job, you've got a very good chance of prevailing in an election contest. So you sort of overlay that across the American situation. Obviously, incumbency, does that benefit Trump? But then you've got to overlay one of the most important issues, and that's his management of COVID. And obviously, America has not done a great job with that.
Yeah, let's try the screen. Zareen's going to try to share the screen now, so hopefully we get that. We'll actually start with, if you click through, Zareen, so I'm going to say click today, guys. Apologies for that. Let's start with state premiers, actually. This is the results that came through when we were in the field between Wednesday and Sunday. So it sort of, it bridges the election, but the big shift here is a 7-point increase for Daniel Andrews, back up to 61, now that he's allowed people to relieve their house. So that's really interesting. And the other really interesting thing is still no hit for New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian, despite another really rugged week of shredding and deeper and boondoggling. And so again, it says to me that you can read whatever you like into the Queensland election, but it's an incumbency period at the moment, and incumbents got re-elected and probably will continue to be re-elected for the time being, unless they're as bad as Trump.
Unless there is, well, and let's not write off Trump. I'll believe Trump loses when I say it. Yeah, incumbency and competence are obviously pretty important factors at the moment. And in terms of the rebound for Andrews, that's exactly right, Peter. Obviously, lockdown is obviously easing in Victoria, and that will be a factor. But the other factor that we shouldn't discount is the successful suppression, which triggered the easing of the lockdowns. Right? It's sort of like I know all my friends in Melbourne are like desperately grateful to be able to leave the house and are profoundly relieved that period has ended, at least for now. But I reckon equally present here is the fact that the suppression strategy has worked, and so you see a rebound, I suppose, in public support for Andrews.
You want to click it, Zareen? So this is the journey of this is the rating of the Victorian state government response. Two things. Obviously, there's been an uptick, but also, yes, there was a 10% drop, but it never went through the floor.
It's fascinating.
And that's interesting in the context of Josh Frydenberg's performance in Parliament last week when the restrictions were, and you wrote a fantastic piece about this, but do you want to just give those that may have missed the speech a context? It felt kind of unhinged, the whole thing. And I wonder if it was a political strategy, it was a personal response, and whether you think it landed or backfired.
Was a bit of both, and it's. I'll run you quickly both through the piece and the response to it, which is also entirely unscientific, but nonetheless interesting. If people missed it, there was a motion in Parliament last week that Labor brought forward that was designed to congratulate the people of Victoria for weathering what has been a very difficult winter. And it was a bit of procedural shenanigans by Labor. By bringing forward the motion, they wanted to sort of highlight the fact that the Prime Minister had not brought forward such a motion. That kind of set the tone for the debate, which became Morrison's comments were fine and Albanese's comments were fine, but things started to deteriorate as the debate went on, and there were contributions from Richard Marles praising the Victorian Premier, and then Josh Frydenberg got up and had what can only be described as a red mist moment. Look, why did he do it? Well, it's a combination of things. I think he is obviously a resident of Victoria. His own family have found lockdown difficult. Their friends have found lockdown difficult, like everyone in Victoria. He has views. He's a resident of the state. He's a stakeholder. He has views. So there's that. There's also, I think, the state, while these metrics show us that there's a certain, shall we say, residual kind of, well, forgiveness is a stupid word, but there's a baseline level of support for Andrews, even though things went quite south in the state.
There was a tolerance for mistakes.
There's a tolerance. Thank you. Tolerance was the word I was reaching for, right? So this data shows us that there is a tolerance here. But I do know that opinion is very sharply divided in Victoria, that tolerance notwithstanding. Some people are extraordinarily angry with the Andrews government and the perceived managerial failings, well, perceived and actual managerial failings. And then some. There's another cohort in Victoria who have sort of dug in behind the Premier and his management, seeing the Premier very much as a victim of Scott Morrison's politicking and a victim of sort of mainstream media fetish obsessions, right? So anybody who's sort of has a social media presence on any platform will understand that this debate is a thing, has been a thing for months. In terms of just so Frydenberg gave his speech. I thought the tone was very inappropriate. It was a day where it was with those resting divisions. I think it was a day to bring residents of the state together and bring citizens of a country together, looking forward to the next phase of dealing with this crisis. And I thought Frydenberg appointed himself tribal warrior in chief. Now, the point of mentioning tribal warrior is that I think part of Frydenberg's thinking, apart from personal frustration as a resident of Victoria, was he wanted to represent that anger. He wanted to ventilate that anger in the national parliament. That is a real anger. There's no doubt about it. He wanted to represent those people who are very angry about what's happened in Victoria and what Andrews hasn't done. Now, obviously, that's a choice you can make as a parliamentarian from Victoria and a person who wants to channel the disappointment of your own base in the national parliament during a debate. You can obviously make that decision, and he did. And he was lauded by fellow travellers for doing so. There was a lot of praise for Frydenberg's speech. But in terms of the feedback I got after the piece that I wrote, which was pretty sharp, my feedback was sort of 2/3 of readers who, and I'm counting people who took the time to write me an email as opposed to just shooting something off on Twitter. So people who took the time to sit down and write me an email. 2/3 of the responses, I would say, roughly were supporting the sharpness in my piece, saying that Frydenberg had been entirely inappropriate and this was terrible, that he'd done this. About 1/3 very strongly in the other direction. Frydenberg had every right to be angry on our behalf. I'm so grateful that he represented our interests in the parliament. You don't understand because you don't live in Victoria how difficult this has been. So, and I got more feedback on that piece than anything I've written this year. So there was that tells me several things. Tells me that Victorians are highly engaged with politics and the management of COVID, which you would appreciate. Tells me the state is divided, and that experience, while I respect the fact that there are different views in Victoria, I thought in the end it kind of reinforced my general thesis, which is when things are divided like that, when people are really tense and head up, the resort for a parliamentarian who aspires to be Prime Minister, as Frydenberg does, is to try and bring people together. But anyway, that's a matter of ongoing dispute.
Indeed. What gets me is it feels to me that kind of anger and pile on for a mistake in a time when we know people are tolerating mistakes because it is such a extraordinary year is politically self-defeating for him, because that tolerance of mistakes allows a leave pass for the surplus that never occurred. It sets up a leave pass for what's happened in nursing homes. It creates a climate which just reinforces incumbency. We don't need to be perfect. We just need to be delivering an outcome that's better than anywhere else in the world. So it felt to me that he's kind of undermining his own value of incumbency by going so hard at Andrews.
Yeah, well, there's sort of been a couple of things here that are a bit ironic, I suppose I'd put it that way. A step back from your observation, which I agree with, Peter, is the sort of strange spectacle we've had over the last few months of a federal government campaigning to reopen the state of Victoria, right? Like out there saying we need to open up immediately and boring into Andrews. Well, think about that from a point of view of human behaviour, right? If you're Daniel Andrews, you know the government's going to bore into you, if the government in Canberra is going to bore into you if you get anything wrong, even 0.5 millimetre wrong, right? So you, in fact, avowedly, if you're the federal government, want the state to reopen, but by your constant campaigning, you're creating the conditions where Andrews is going to take the most risk averse political decision possible in terms of reopening, right? So that's one irony. Then there's another irony about what you've spoken of there, which is sort of weird, because there is this tolerance or permissiveness or whatever that's baked in at the moment, right? Provided you are doing your best, provided that you're showing up to work every day, trying your hardest, listening to experts, trying to roll out these complicated policy responses to a massive crisis, the biggest crisis we've all seen in our lifetimes, right? The electorate will broadly give you a tick because they feel like you're making moral choices on their behalf, that you're showing up for work, you're doing your best. You can't be expected to get everything perfect, right?
Yeah.
As you say, Peter, this is a discount that could apply across the board to governments across the board. So it's kind of weird why, the government just can't bank the discount, and why it needs to revert to this sort of partisan, we must win every point, we must win every battle, we must define our opponents all the time, right? But it's the psychology of, politics. It's kind of like,
line, you give them a hammer and they see a nail.
No, exactly. It's like, it's sort of amazing, really.
But there's been a few questions in the chat also about the underperformance of One Nation, and there's probably a lot of reasons for that. But my other take on that is, like, as it's a time for incumbents, it is actually not a time for grievance. The politics of grievance doesn't really work when your state is dealing with a pandemic. Is that a fair?
No, I think that's right. I think, obviously, the vote tends to polarize, right, in terms of, return to major parties is what I mean by that, rather than polarize in the general sense, right? The kind of vote returns to major parties. People aren't flirting with disruptors or grievance merchants. They just want solutions that they think, one or other of the major parties deliver. And I think that's sort of what you would expect in the current environment. But it is very interesting to compare that result in Queensland with the result in Queensland at the federal election, which was only 2019 after all, right? It's quite a different result. And interesting too that Clive Palmer was very active in the Queensland election, promulgating death taxes and other messages that he promulgated during the federal campaign to some effect. But it just didn't resonate in this contest.
It didn't have the same hook, and I don't know if it's you can't play the same trick twice. It wasn't that Labor was running a tax agenda, a tax reform agenda, which gave the death tax something to hook onto.
Yeah, gave it salience, exactly.
And, let's face it, the Queensland campaign was very much pointed at the problems that had occurred in the federal. They were talking about mining, they were talking about extra police. Like it wasn't like this was an endorsement of a socialist government by any stretch of the imagination.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Do you want to click it, Zareen? Federal ICAC, we obviously had this in the field before. I don't know if we can call what was announced yesterday in ICAC. There was huge support for something that looks and smells like an ICAC, and there was a pretty resounding rejection of the idea that the Prime Minister had put forward that there was too much on the plate to do it. Now, in a way, this might be an archival slide now, but do you think that the body, as announced overnight, will meet the concerns of that 81%? Is it enough to say, yes, we've done something, or are there some issues with the model that's been put forward?
Well, I think there's certainly issues with the model that's been put forward. There's no doubt about that. Every kind of, legally trained person in Australia and some other quarters of the world have come out since the announcement to point out deficiencies in the model that Christian Porter has brought forward. In terms of, how does that play then? Well, it's interesting at a couple of levels, right? Like, Peter, as you said, this is kind of an archival slide and not, in the sense that it references the explanations that the Prime Minister gave last week about why we couldn't proceed with an ICAC right now, right? Which is that we're very, very busy people in the middle of a pandemic. Thank you very much. So we can't do it now. About
spraying squillions around.
Yeah, but literally 4 or 5 days later, ICAC appears, right, with no reference to the argument last week that we couldn't possibly walk and chew gum at the same time. Now, Why did that happen? Well, because the government knows this issue's red hot, right? And it's got to have something to say about it. So the government brought forward its ICAC model, despite having said 5 days previously it couldn't possibly do so. Now, anyway, setting that aside for 1 minute, what happens now? Well, obviously the government sort of set a clock now. They've set a public consultation period of 6 months. They want this sort of exhaustive, let 1,000 flowers bloom process, right, where everybody raises issues with it. I did ask Christian Porter in the press conference yesterday whether the government intended to listen to any of the suggestions during the consultation period. Would it adopt any of the obvious criticisms that will be made about this model? The principal one being, why no public hearings when it involves politicians, right?
And no public references either. It's only being referred.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's exactly right. Like, would the government listen? Like, the obvious criticism that was going to be made first up is, why no public hearings, right? Would the government listen to that? Would it respond to that? Porter didn't commit himself one way or the other, but his answer was very strongly suggestive of, no, we won't listen to that. This is our model and this is how we want to proceed with it. So I think I genuinely think this is delicate for the government. They don't have to resolve this for 6 months because they're now consultating down the clock, as it were, right? It doesn't come back to Parliament for 6 months because they're dedicated to this process, which 5 days ago they said they couldn't run during a pandemic. But anyway, never mind. They're now dedicated to the 6 months. When it gets back to Parliament, I suspect the crossbenchers in the Senate, most of them will say this is inadequate. We need to do something else here. Well, that's the critical point for the government. Do they actually stand on their digs and say, no, this is our model, our way or the highway, and literally take that policy to an election when there's a resting 80% community support for a national ICAC? I would think that's a pretty brave face to present at the next election.
Although it will always come down to salience, won't it? Like, we know there's 80% support, but when you line it up against tax cuts, jobs, health, that's the problem.
Of course.
You've actually got to have a commitment to a functioning democracy to get this through. I don't think it will ever be forced by the public. It's actually something that leaders have to impose on themselves. Or
no, I agree. It's sort of like, it's the conundrum.
Or we move on to the next slide, which is kind of, there is a line here, like, and I put a pretty clumsy column in The Guardian today trying to draw a line between ICAC and institutions that protect democracy and where America's gone. And it's not a line, but there is this scrawny track that takes you from one to the other, which says that if you don't value your institutions and your democracy and the integrity of them, then of course you're going to end up with a carnival. Which is what they're doing.
Absolutely. And look, I agree. I mean, it's in the pessimism pot with climate change, right? Like, 80% of the country says they're really worried about climate change, but they haven't voted, that they haven't voted as if they are, right? Yeah. Similarly here, same thing. Do people vote as if they're really concerned about corruption at a federal level? Well, but I think if we sort of draw this back just really quickly to the pandemic, Peter, what we've seen is that people sort of daring to trust institutions and political processes once again. That's really important, what's happened. A smart government seriously would bank that trust by being trustworthy, by doing things that warranted trust, right? I do think, even though it won't determine the outcome of the next federal election, I do think it is super dumb if they miss the cue on this, if they miss the opportunity where people have crept up again and thought, okay, you're not a completely stupendous dickhead, right? I might be able to listen to you for a few minutes every day and might be able to broadly trust what you say.
Low bar.
But that's so important at the moment, right? Like, if we look at that sort of, post-truth horror show that's happening in the other hemisphere right now, right? Being able to trust what politicians say to a functional degree is critically important.
So, one more question before we move on. How much of the resistance to a toothy as opposed to toothless ICAC, do you think is principled, i.e. they just don't see that sort of role of an extrajudicial body? And how much of it is because, my God, we've got sports rorts, we've got water rorts, we've got everything Angus does, we've got the airport, like that they just don't want to go there? Like, how much do you think it's practical? How much do you think it's principled?
Well, a little of both, in the sense that I want to, pay some respect to some of the arguments that are made against sort of kangaroo court style processes in ICACs around the country, like that there are sort of fast and loose procedural elements associated with ICACs. I think that is not in dispute, really. And I can understand why parliamentarians will be reluctant to sort of do the walk of shame in instances where there's not proof that they've done something wrong. So I think some of those sort of fine-grained arguments are reasonable. In terms of the resistance, though, it's not so much someone sitting there keeping score of specific questionable instances of things that have happened in federal politics over the last couple of terms. Although that's one thing. It's like the government has got to manage its people as well, in terms of that transition from a gummy ICAC to an ICAC with baby teeth, say. You've got to be able to do that without your own party room completely exploding, right? And there are people in the government, and there'll be people on the Labor side too, who would say, ICAC with teeth over my dead body. So
I reckon gummy ICAC is now a thing. I like that. I will copyright that to you. And on that note, on the note of gummy ICAC, let's dive in to see what would happen if the election for the US president was being fought in Australia. Do you want to click the screen, Zoraine? Now, Biden wins. He wins well. 26% though.
Yeah, I confess I did a double take when I looked at that share. It was higher than I thought it would be.
And I'm going to dig out the actual crosstabs because they're really interesting too. If you just want to filibuster for me for a sec there.
Yes, I can certainly do that. Yes, I thought, look, obviously I'm aware that Trump has devotees both in America and all around the world. There's always a market for a demagogue, but I confess 26% support was higher than where I thought it would be, given the sort of the chaos that we're seeing in America at the moment. It's kind of like I just look at that with just a sort of almost dysfunctional level of alarm. And I suppose I would think that there would be more alarm in the community about Trumpism, as it were, and all it represents, right? By that, I don't mean the showmanship. I mean the anti-democratic elements of Trumpism that are sort of deeply alarming. But anyway, look, there you go, 26%. There he is.
Coalition voters, it was 44 to 38 to Biden, so almost line ball, 8% unsure. Labor 60-20 to Biden with 20 unsure, 1 in 5. And then the one I don't get is 1 in 10 Green voters, 10%. I don't know if they're just taking the piss, but I'm still interested to find out what's going on there. Yeah. But the coalition, it's kind of line ball. So that Trump, we always say that the Democrats are kind of close to a wet Liberal Party rather than a traditional Labor Party, if you're sort of looking, and then the Republicans more at the right. But this sort of sits the Trump Democrat split almost 50-50. There's been a number of coalition former MPs, Alexander Downer for one. I saw Terry Barnes out there, who was one of Abbott's advisors, and they're going, at the end of the day, you may not like him, but Trump's should win, and I want him to win. So what do you think the thinking? And of course, as Aussie Joe, I think Joe Hockey probably is, I don't think he's said it, but he's hedged his bets pretty heavily towards a Trump victory as well.
Well, I suppose there's, it's sort of, politics is tribal. red team, blue team. If you're on red team, well, you're on red team, hold your nose. I mean, that's what the Republicans are doing in America with this guy, with Trump. Most of them, overwhelming majority of them, that's what they're doing. So sort of unsurprising, I suppose, that filters back into ideological fellow travellers of the Republican Party in Australia. And so I suppose it's just partisanship is part of the answer, and part of the answer sort of going back to the high level of community support for an ICAC. A lot of people like Trump because they think, I mean, this is, I struggle to get my head around this. The man is the president of the United States, right? But there is a sort of cohort who continues to view him as an outsider to politics and to the institutions of politics. Like that whole drain the swamp message of Trump's is very resonant everywhere in the world, not just in America. So some people like Trump because, he continues to sort of stick it to establishment mores, right? And that's sufficient in a tribal sense to think he's okay. But it's, it's sort of, where I have pause is not so much at the partisan end of things. It's at the anti-democratic end of things. That's what makes me nervous, because it's sort of like you've got to look at what this guy's doing as well as what he's saying. And what he's doing is just phenomenally destructive to the Republic of America and to America's standing in the world. It's sort of, I don't know, I just, when you weigh up those variables, right, like I get quite angry at politicians too for not being fed income, for not doing what they said they'd do, for the kind of evasions and sort of compromises of politics drive me bonkers too, right? Like I would love a disruptor to come in and do something else, but this guy, the disruption is in an anti-democratic direction, and I honestly don't know how anyone can legitimise that, regardless of where their own views sit on the ideological spectrum.
Now, in the comments, a few eagle eyes have picked up that doesn't add up to 100, it adds up to 101. That's because if you round up and you've got a 0.6 and a 0.6, it looks higher. There was one theory on the Green voters that it could be anti-vaxxers. Thank you, Scott. Although Joe also points out that anti-vaxxer isn't actually Green policy, which is also true. And there is also a bit of a comment there that the high support for Trump could be linked to the fact that even News Limited in Australia has been pretty pro-Trumpy, and a number of, in fact, it's almost been part of the apparatus at times for getting the Trump message out into the global marketplace of ideas.
Maybe, or maybe people, sort of just like Trump. I mean, no. I'm not trying to minimise the media's role in creating this monster. I'm totally on board with that thesis, but it's just like, I don't know. There's something compelling about this guy to some voters who feel very alienated from establishment politics, and I just think we shouldn't underestimate the resonance of that. In our own politics as well as internationally. I think you're missing, the elephant is most decidedly in the room, and it's probably wise not to miss it when it shows up and stands in the corner.
Do you want to give it another click, Zoreen? So favourability, I think we can go with that fairly quickly. It reinforces pretty much the same. The next one's the one I'm interested in, I think. So another click, Zoreen. Okay, their attributes, so that was the character, and again, I think we don't need to spend too long on that. Like, they're the ones we use for Australian leaders, and can I say that none of them have ever been that high or that low, so he's an outlier, including in Australia. One more click. Okay, so what does it mean to Australia? So these are interesting, Katharine. We'll go through them one by one and then maybe come up for air. 72% say it's important for the Prime Minister to have a good relationship with the US President, whoever they might be, for the good of the nation. That's kind of reflects I think, bipartisan policy and why you won't see either the leader or the opposition leader weighing into the presidential election anyway.
Yeah.
But 65 agree the presidency's diminished the USA's reputation. And 54 say the US is less relevant to Australia's interest than it has been in the past. Now, they're kind of interrelated, I think, those propositions.
2 and 3. Yeah.
It does mean that while we're fixated on this, we're also looking at it as something happening over there, not so much happening here.
Well, I mean, the sort of upside, didn't we start this conversation sort of by feeling powerless? There's this whole thing happening on the other side of the world that we have no agency in or over. The flip side of that,
arguably the biggest story today is the Chinese upping their trade blockages of Australia.
Well, if the latest thing is in fact happening, it's a little bit unclear. It probably is happening, but it's that the new element today is a little bit unclear. But certainly like China, what happens with China in this region and to us is certainly of equal or more significance than anything that's going to happen in America over the next sort of 24 to 48 hours. So yeah, look, I think we're watching, but we can dissociate. We sort of we think the alliance benefits Australia because, as you say, that's a kind of that's a propagation of major party politics in Australia. That's the line we've all grown up with. America is Australia's most important security ally. America has been a sort of stabilising influence in the world post-war. We've all grown up around those notions. We think the idea of that is more powerful than any single occupant of the White House. And that is probably right, but you wouldn't want to bet the house on it. In terms of 2 and 3, well, that just does show that we are following this through a geostrategic lens. We're following what's happened in America over the past 4 years, that the American century is kind of waning. They've sort of hit a peak of power and then they're waning, and Trump has accelerated that sort of sense of global skepticism as America as the most powerful nation in the world. Right, Trump's undermined that and undermined America's international standing. And so I don't know, it suggests to me that we've got a sort of good conceptual handle on what's actually played out over the last 4 years.
And that final point, 32% say the Trump presidency's been good for Australia. By omission, you'd say the majority of people then don't think it's been a net benefit, and that bears out in the other numbers. I feel like we haven't really given anyone a chance to ask questions, but this has been fascinating, and I haven't been really running the screen very well. We had a few Melbourne Cup questions. I feel it's irrelevant today. We might just come up for air and end the share screen, Serene. There's less enthusiasm for Melbourne Cup than before, but I don't know if we can read anything deeper into it at the moment.
The whole day just feels massively surreal. It's sort of like I can't. Well, I mean, it's a combination of the pandemic and the fact that people are glued to what's going to happen in America, but it's pretty weird. It's just like, anyway, you're right not to bog us down, but it's a weird sort of cup day for sure.
So if anyone's got a question or a comment, just sort of get to the top of the chat so I can see it, and I'll call you up in the last 10 minutes. I'll just tell you a bit about what we're doing tomorrow. And look, it's not going to be like this. It's not going to be an intense presentation. The idea is we've created this space where people come into and share time. So we know we've got this really big external event going on, which is the election. Most people will be watching on their TV or on a screen. The proposition is that we just have this room open. If people want to come in, make comments, interact with other people, rather than tweet angrily into the void, we will be here. We'll have a bunch of our friends that are around and maybe have a chat every now and then and dip in and out. But I'm not an anchor, and I'm not going to pretend to be a commentator either. So yeah, as Craig says, maybe a grief counselling session if need be. I suspect we will there'll be a couple of waves tomorrow if what I'm hearing is right. The first will be those that count early will have a fair idea of what's going to be happening in Florida by lunchtime tomorrow. And if that's rolling blue, then that's one future. There's a couple of other states that call early, including South Carolina and Iowa, I believe.
Mhm.
And then there's others where it's just going to be discombobulating because the votes will be coming through. It's going to be really hard for people to do the Anthony Green trick and say this county's gone up or down, because it's going to be about the postals and the reds. And then I think in a horrible world, by about 2:00 tomorrow afternoon, Trump will probably get up and claim victory no matter what and try to turn it into a court challenge. So, it'll be something.
It'll
And I
certainly be something.
definitely don't feel like being on my own. So we'll have the room open, and anyone that wants to be there is really, really welcome. We've had a couple of hundred RSVPs, so we'll work it out. I encourage people to bring alcohol if needed as well. I'll probably get a 6-pack of Bud. So you've seen drunk history. We might end up with drunk politics tomorrow. So a good question from Karen here. How can Australia influence US politics, considering that the US definitely influences ours? What has been Australia's influence on what's gone on, do you reckon?
Well, I think certainly, unlike, like, the short answer to the question is we don't influence American politics because we're a minnow and they're enormous. But with that said, Scott Morrison has made an interesting call as Prime Minister to be as close as one can possibly get to the administration without being sort of co-opted into their rolling madness. And that has been, I'm often, hard on the Prime Minister, but that's been an act of judgment that's been genuinely interesting. And he has, by and large, managed to pull that off. And not every world leader is up for that. Like most world leaders, having had a sort of early kind of attempt of engagement with Trump, have kind of backed right off, particularly in recent years. I'm thinking about European leaders like Macron and Angela Merkel, and even to some extent Trudeau has kind of like been hit in the kind of maelstrom, whereas we've crept right up to the door of the administration. We know the administration will open the door for Australia because we show up. And that's been probably useful because obviously, we got a favourable result on steel tariffs and a couple of other things during Trump's really
there was that famous early phone call with Turnbull
and the
as
phone
well.
call. Yes, yeah. And obviously the refugee agreement, which Turnbull managed to tiptoe through the minefield and preserve, right? So while we don't influence the polity of America in any shape or form, I think we've probably got to pay these guys, both Turnbull and Morrison, for keeping Australia at the table, get what you can get, and avoid the really serious barking mad stuff. But the thing is, if we've got 4 more years of Trump, that balance becomes harder to strike, because obviously he's around for another 4 years. There's God knows what he'll do, what the second term agenda will be. God knows what adventurism could surface. God knows what conundrums then Australia will face. So I reckon that the government will be pretty pleased. No one would say this publicly, but I reckon there'd be a bit of a sigh of relief if it was Joe Biden who came up sailed up past Donald Trump tomorrow. That would be my gut feeling. I don't know that there would be any really, really serious barracking champions for Trump in our administration, because there's not only the partisan consideration, there's also the practical management. I wouldn't like to be Scott Morrison trying to.
Final question: what's your evaluation of the role of Joe Hockey? And you would have also noted the Senate hearings this week that we invested heavily in a thought partner for Joe, who's now become a business partner.
Yeah, I know. What is a thought partner, and can I have one?
I'd like to be one. I think you're my thought partner. but it's a
gonna
pro
say,
bono
perhaps
one. Yeah.
perhaps we are each other's thought partners. And that's very pleasant. But yeah, neither of us is turning a buck out of it. Let's be honest. So yeah, I don't know. No, that was quite something. Obviously, I can't remember if it was the foreign minister or the DFAT secretary who noted delicately at one point that hockey had forged a different path diplomatically to,
he was innovative. Yeah.
Well, he was innovative. He was an innovative diplomat, which is sort of DFAT speak for we're not entirely certain what went on there. But anyway, he enjoyed his time in Washington, Joe Hockey, very much.
All right. Well, I don't feel like jinxing with a prediction.
No.
I'm just going to, in polls,
No.
I trust. In polls,
No.
I trust.
I'm not going to say anything apart
All
from
right.
fear. I'm terrified. I could be in the fetal position basically from now on.
Well, you're welcome to dip in at any time tomorrow if you need the love of the room, Katharine.
Thank you.
For the rest of you, I'll see you tomorrow. I'm sorry I've been a horrible host today and haven't given the floor to anyone, but tomorrow the mics are open. So bring your thoughts, bring your, particularly those like Craig and Terry who have been having a crack today. Hope to see you back tomorrow and help me fill the void that we will feel until we know what's happening to the future of Western civilization. Hey, thanks everybody, and I'll catch up with you tomorrow.